Japan is not facing a rumor. It's facing a financial emergency of unprecedented scale, one that's been set in motion by a sudden, massive economic shift in China. What happens next could completely reshape global power, from the US Treasury markets all the way to Asia's security systems. Stay with me, because if Japan falls, the shockwaves will ripple through every economy, including yours. Ladies and gentlemen, the crisis you're about to hear about didn't begin with a single headline or a surprise military move. No, it started with a tremor, an almost invisible shift beneath the very foundations of Asia's economic order. China and Japan, two giants bound by trade but torn apart by history, they've entered a phase of maximum tension, a phase where diplomacy falters and economic warfare begins to replace conversation. In Beijing, the escalation wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It was planned, calculated, deliberate. China announced sweeping restrictions on rare earth exports. It increased regulatory inspections on Japanese tech firms and quietly told its state-owned banks to reconsider their investments in Japanese corporations. This was a pressure campaign masquerading as policy, an attack hidden in plain sight. And it hit Japan exactly where it's most vulnerable: supply chains, advanced materials, manufacturing stability. But why now? Why this moment? Well, Japan crossed a line in Beijing's eyes. Its deepening alignment with Washington, its involvement in semiconductor restrictions, its growing military cooperation under the US-Japan Security Alliance, it all became a threat. To China, Japan was no longer just a competitor, it was a collaborator in America's containment strategy. And Beijing didn't just protest, it retaliated. In Tokyo, the blow was felt almost immediately. Automakers scrambled to find substitutes for rare earth materials. Pharmaceutical companies faced delays in critical ingredients. Tech firms now feared their China-based operations were being used as political pawns. The government met in emergency sessions, understanding that this was no ordinary diplomatic spat. This was an economic battlefield, one far more dangerous than any maritime conflict in the East China Sea. Inside Japan's corridors of power, anxiety and defiance mixed. Hardliners argued that China's actions proved Beijing's thirst for regional dominance. Moderates warned against escalation, fearing a complete economic decoupling would destabilize Asia's entire market. But for the first time in decades, Japan realized its economic stability itself was under siege. And halfway across the Pacific, Washington was watching closely. America's most critical ally in Asia was being targeted, and the situation was escalating fast. For American strategists, this wasn't just an economic maneuver. This was a message from Beijing. We're opening a new front in the US-China rivalry. In Tokyo, hesitation was no longer an option. The Prime Minister convened an emergency council. Economic ministers, defense strategists, intelligence chiefs, all reporting troubling news. Factories warned of imminent shutdowns. Japanese tech companies were being choked by China's regulatory grip. And worse, satellite intelligence was showing unusual activity in the East China Sea. Tokyo understood that this wasn't just a trade war. China was using its economy as a weapon, and Japan had to respond. The Prime Minister ordered a countermeasure package, decouple from Chinese rare earths, relocate critical manufacturing back to Japan or trusted regional partners, and issue a formal diplomatic protest. But Beijing's response was swift and furious. State-run media launched attacks, accusing Japan of fabricating threats to justify militarism. China also signaled it would escalate further if Tokyo continued aligning with Washington. And in global markets, investors began to panic. Asian currencies fluctuated wildly. The specter of an all-out economic war between the world's second and third largest economies loomed large. At home in Japan, fear spread quickly. The public, already reeling from the Fukushima disaster, felt something even bigger unfolding. The media was abuzz with rumors of shortages, price hikes, and a national emergency on the horizon. Then, late one night, the phone rang. Washington had entered the fray. The United States was no longer a distant observer. Within 24 hours of Japan's emergency briefing, Washington struck back. Hard. The U.S. Treasury issued a statement condemning China's economic coercion, while the Pentagon redeployed 2 Navy destroyers to Japan's East China Sea defense zone. It was a signal. America will not let Japan face this alone. The US and Japan began to mobilize, but China wasn't backing down. Beijing's response? More economic restrictions, more cyber attacks, more maritime intimidation. The global response was electrifying. Markets tumbled. Investors scrambled to assess the fallout. European capitals, ASEAN nations, and global corporations were caught in the crossfire. The Indo-Pacific, once a zone of growing prosperity, was now a geopolitical fault line. And then, just as tensions reached their peak, China made its most aggressive move yet: a full-scale economic embargo against Japan. China suspended all civilian and industrial exports to Japan, targeting the core of its economy. The shock was seismic. Japan's markets collapsed. Factories stopped production. People rushed to stores to stockpile, fearing critical shortages.
The Prime Minister, usually calm, stood before the nation with a trembling voice. "We are entering the most critical hour of our modern history." This wasn't just an economic crisis anymore. This was an existential fight. The US quickly responded, invoking Article 5 of the US-Japan Security Treaty. Not for military action, but to defend Japan's economic sovereignty. Sanctions were imposed. China was cornered.
And then came the most coordinated Western response since the early Cold War. The US, Europe, Australia, Canada, countries from all corners of the globe chose their sides. Beijing, stunned, could hardly react. For Beijing, this was a nightmare scenario. What began as an economic gamble to assert dominance had spiraled into a global confrontation. The world's economies were now on the line. This wasn't just about China and Japan anymore. This was about a new geopolitical order, one where the stakes were nothing less than global stability. As both Tokyo and Beijing stood on the brink, one thing was certain. This was no longer just a regional dispute. This was the dawn of a new, dangerous era, a time when the balance of power would be rewritten, and the world's most fragile alliances tested to the breaking point. And so, we wait. The question is no longer if the world will be changed, but when. This crisis is just beginning. Stay tuned and make sure you're prepared. Like, subscribe, and comment below to join the conversation. What do you think will happen next? How will this conflict reshape the world as we know it?